Welcome, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about developing iOS and Android apps with Flutter and Firebase. So when we started putting together our apps for our event here today, DevFest Florida, we had a few organizers. This is last year, right? We had a few organizers. We didn't have a whole lot of time. There were a whole bunch of unforeseen tasks that kind of popped up. And these are things that just go hand in hand with running a conference. Things never get finished, and the app was one of them. So that kind of fell by the wayside. What we were originally hoping to do this year was to replicate this. So this is written by Ryan Harder of Chicago Roboto. So if anybody's interested, they've got tickets going on sale now. I know their CFP is also open. It's an Android conference. It takes place in Chicago in April. It's a great conference if you get a chance to go, but this app is phenomenal. It's written in Kotlin for Android, originally written in Java. It's open source, and I know 360 AndDev, which is a Denver-based conference, also uses. It's a great app for conferences, so let's just take a quick look at what it does and why it's great. So right from the jump here, you're looking at the schedule. It's incredibly clear. You see what's going on, when the sessions start, where they are, who's speaking. And unlike this morning, they have the right schedules. So there's a hamburger menu in the upper left. When it slides out, you can view the speakers, get information on the location, all that kind of good stuff, right? You go back to the schedule or the speakers, and if you tap on either one of them, you drill into more details on either the session or the speaker. Great, right? But the problem with this is, now this year we started planning a lot earlier, and as we were becoming a bigger event, we found we had less time to be able to do this, even though we started much earlier. And we wanted to have an app that all of our attendees can use, right? The Android users and the iOS users, right? We didn't want to leave out half of the smartphone market. Microsoft Windows phones, no one cares. Looking at you. So, mobile app development, right? Got a couple of options, right? Knowing we were going to build our own, started looking at the usual suspects. If we built an app in Kotlin for Android, we'd also have to build an app in Swift for iOS or Objective-C. We could have used JavaScript or React, and that would have been a fine solution. But I'm an iOS and Android developer, and I don't know those platforms very well. So I don't want to start learning that, because that's going to just take more time. I wouldn't feel as comfortable. So prior to Google I/O this year, there was an article about Google's experimental new mobile OS called Fuchsia. And Fuchsia ran these apps that were written in Flutter, with Flutter. So what's Flutter? Well, it's interesting to see what Google's working on, the future of mobile OS. Fuchsia and Flutter seemed really cool. Kind of put it out of my mind, right, when I heard about this. And then later that week, this is the week of I/O, later that week, I'm streaming the conference from home, and I just happened to see a Flutter session come up, and I start watching it because I'm interested. So I'm checking it out. And Emily Shack and Emily Fortuna live code a Flutter-based app, which is a chat app, which is like the modern day Hello World, right? So it's a chat app. And it ran natively on iOS and Android, and they went through all the different things you could do with Flutter. And my mind was just blown. And I have the link to this talk here up in the speaker notes, and I'll make the slides available. So fantastic presentation, great way to make an app. Again, one code base, two apps, right? Now, I know what you're all thinking. Another speaker is going to get up here and talk to you about this new language, these new platforms, these new SDKs, and how great it is and how it can replace everything you're doing today in production, right? So how it's the best thing since gluten-free avocado toast, right? So it is great, though, all right? And I'm really excited to talk to you guys about this and introduce you to it if you haven't heard about it. But before I do, I want to walk you a little bit through Dart. And the Dart is the language you'll use to write your apps in Flutter, okay? So if you've done Java development or C# development before, Dart will look very familiar. A lot of the declarations are exactly the same. Like Kotlin, it's also been around since 2011. It was originally developed for Google to replace JavaScript. So that's kind of a cool fact. Now you can find it running on the web, servers, mobile devices, and even some IoT devices. It's also open sourced, it's on GitHub, and it's under a standard specification body. So there are some rules to this. It's not some gunslingers at Google trying to put this code out there. So Dart 2.0 is something that's coming out very soon. It's in pre-release right now. It's truly statically typed. All right. Right now, Dart 1.0 is dynamically typed, and you can opt in for type safety with strong mode. It also offers the cascading method syntax many of you are used to using when you do RX programming. It was built, again, to replace JavaScript, so that means it can compile into JavaScript if you need it to. And it runs on the Dart VM, which is written in C++. So things are pretty quick. All this is great, but who is using Dart, and is this going to be the next Google Glass? Okay. I hope there's no one from Google here. It's recorded. That's great. So am I going to invest the time and effort to have Google, kind of pull the rug out from underneath me as I'm starting my apps in Flutter? So you don't have to worry about Dart going away anytime soon, right? And here's why. Dart is used at Google in the consumer-facing web apps of the AdWords and AdSense team, as well as the Fiber team. So here's the thing. While you may think of Google as a technology company, Google is at its core an advertising company. And for them to use Dart in the AdWords and AdSense platforms, it's not going anywhere. That's kind of their bread and butter. So I don't think they're giving up on Dart anytime soon. So let's take a quick look at the Dart class that we're going to use to represent a conference session in our app. So we'll have a lot of the basics to demonstrate what someone that's never seen this before understand and see. So we'll handle constructors, overriding methods, private fields, getters, setters, string manipulation. All right. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right. Okay. So what you'll see here, I'm not going to go too far off podium here, but what you'll see here is you've got the class session. Excuse me one sec. Okay, so what you'll see here is you have the class session. So that's pretty straightforward so far. You have your int underscore attendee count, which is equal to 0. And the underscores denote a private field. So instead of having to declare something private, you don't have to use an underscore, and now it's private. Pretty cool. Bool is pretty much the same. False and true are the same thing. We have something that we are using here. You see string ID, description, title, track, and room. Don't write code like that. This is just so it fits up here. Okay. Again, we have a list of speakers, a list of strings that represent the speaker ID. And then here we have our constructor. So our constructor, we're just going to pass in a title, description, track, speakers. And in the brackets here, you see this dot room and this dot is favorite. So inside the brackets of our constructor, we can set optional arguments, which is neat, right? So what happens if you want to have multiple constructors, okay? Well, you really can't. So what they do in Dart is they have this concept of a named constructor. So what you're doing is what you see here with session.load from Firebase, where we pass in a string and a hash map, where we can process out what's going on from our map. So pretty cool. All right. We have our getter. So this looks a little bit odd, right? So here we're just using lambdas. We've just got one return. So we're going to return this attendee count in our attendee counter getter. And we have a setter for attendee counter. And that's just going to pass in this int. Oh, sorry. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so here's our setter. All right, so this looks a little bit more familiar, right? No lambdas here, straight up setting that parameter to our attribute. And if we scroll a little bit further down here, we'll have our override of toString. And let me see if I can make this bigger here. Is that better? Perfect. So we're going to override our string, our toString method, and we're going to turn back the session. We're going to pass in the title. We have some string interpolation here where we're passing in the title, inline, speakers, track, and attendee count. And then scroll a little bit further down. So here we have our main method, and we're just going to create a new session, and this is just for our test. And here we're going to have a new session where the title of the talk is called Science, more art than science. The title, the subnote here is going to be Wubba Lubba Dub Dub, and this is going to be at DevFest Florida, and the speakers will be a string list of Rick and Morty. Cool. And so below that, what we're going to do is we're going to call before the attendees, print out the session, set the attendee counter, and then print it out again. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. By the way, this is called Dartpad, and if you can access it by going to dartpad.dartlang.org. Again, that'll also be in our slide notes. So you can see here we've got our speaker right up here with our toString. We set our attendee count, and it's reflected here. All right. Cool. So let's kind of get back into the presentation here. So Dart is single-threaded. But if it's single-threaded, then, does this mean my app will experience a lot of freezing while I'm waiting to execute long-running tasks like network calls? And the answer to that question is no, it won't. So in Dart, if you have a var int, which is my process, and you do print, let it go, no Disney jokes, okay. So basically, no. So you can do a lot of cool things that will allow you to still handle multi-threaded applications within this process, right? So one of them is this async await, these keywords here. So using the async keyword tells the runtime that the method immediately returns a future, and the await keyword is used to wait for that async method to return that future value. This is similar to how coroutines work in Kotlin, okay? I don't have a lot of time to go through the demo, so we won't cover that. So let's jump into Flutter, right? So what is Flutter? Flutter is a new mobile app SDK to help developers and designers build modern mobile web apps, modern apps for iOS and Android. And this is according to flutter.io. I highly encourage everybody to visit that. All right. Flutter lets you have one code base written in Dart to build your app for iOS or Android or both. Fantastic, right? It uses functional reactive programming. You have access to native build tools. And right now, Flutter is still in alpha mode. But it's really, really there. I think they're at the point where they're looking at having to move some things over with internationalization. But that's like one of the last bits that they've got. Now, is Flutter too good to be true? Right? So I'm trying to make the case here that it isn't too good to be true, and that's really pretty sweet. So I want to show you how you would go ahead and create your first Flutter app. So first you would need to do is, you used to have to download IntelliJ IDE and install the Flutter plugins and all that. Now you can do this with Android Studio 3.0. So everybody who's an Android developer will probably be familiar with that and probably already have it installed. Download the Flutter and Dart plugins, and you're ready to go. Now, if you don't want to go through that process, we can do it really simple with this command, Flutter create and then what your project name is. This will create a runnable app in about a minute. And you'll have all the code to be able to do this. So I don't want to get into running this and showing you how quick this is because we're kind of crunched for time, but take my word for it or test it out and you'll see how cool that is. All right. And again, if you don't like doing command line stuff, go into Android Studio 3.0 with those plugins and you'll be able to play around with it. All right, Flutter is based on widgets. All right, the widgets define the UI across the board. The widgets get updated by controlling their state, right? So we're going to take a look at some examples of widgets here. So you've got widgets for images, widgets for list views, widgets to define layouts like containers, the rows and columns for those. You have widgets for text. If you're thinking, hey, everything in Flutter is a widget, you're starting to understand Flutter, all right? They're a lot like your Android views or your iOS UI views. So if you think of it like that, if you've done that kind of application development before. And speaking of iOS views, you can see here on the right, there's a bunch of iOS-style widgets called Cupertino widgets. So if you really wanted to use those types of widgets instead of the material widgets, you can go ahead and use those. You can also do a check to see what platform you're executing that code on and determine, okay, do I want to show an iOS-style dialog, or do I want to show a material-style dialog? And you can do that appropriately for that. So you're not locked in at one, and so that your iOS apps look a little off, right? Okay. So there's actually two classes of widgets, right? You've got the stateful widget and the stateless widget. The stateful widget allows the user to interact and change their state, such as checkboxes, text views, or your own custom widgets that need to keep track of state. And stateless widgets don't change, like icon widgets or your own custom widgets that don't necessarily need to change the state of the app. So let's take a quick look at the DevFest Florida app. So here's our main method. Pretty straightforward. We're just going to call run app, pass it the class, and we'll get going. So this DevFest app, let's take a look at that class. And here we go. This is it. This is that class. Is a stateful widget. We're extending a stateful widget. We've got our constructor where we can optionally pass in a key so that Flutter can understand where this sits in the widget tree. And we're going to override create state because, again, this is a stateful widget, and we want to have our state managed by a separate class. And this class is the conf app state class. And if we were to take a look at that, it's a custom state object that helps the stateful widget maintain itself. So here what we're going to do is we're defining some of the routes. So these are like, if you've downloaded the app today, you'll see from the menu, we've got different routes that you can take when you click a button. Go to the schedule page, go to the session page, go to the speaker page, go to the speaker details page. So here we're defining all of that. The next step is we're going to call setUUID. So this is for the rating system. We're going to use this to make sure that you don't constantly give me all fives constantly in the ratings, right? So this makes sure one UUID for every user, and you just can edit your ratings. And then from here, we're just going to return this material app with a title, a theme, with the routes that we've already defined, and our home, which is this new schedule widget, right? And we're going to get into that in a second. All right. So before we jump into IntelliJ and start looking at the schedule home widget, I want to show you how data is organized. Our data is organized in Firebase. So here, just an overview. I'm not going to dive down into each one of these. Right? It's kind of overkill, but here's our root node. It's 2017, and it has a schedule child, a sessions child, and a speakers child. And each one of these is a list of just a list of different nodes that we have as children with all the data we need in them that we can pull out in our app. So how do we do this? How do we get this into Firebase? So the first thing we need to do is, if you're familiar with iOS development, you have a Cocoa pods or a pod file. If you do Android development, you've got your Gradle files. This is basically, we're just going to define our dependencies here in our app. Okay. So up top, we've got our dependencies. It's Flutter. We've got our SDK. We've got some other libraries here. And you see, here's some of the Firebase. Here's some of the Firebase libraries that we're using. We've got some Font Awesome in there. And then below, we've got some other things to manage assets that we want to use in our app, and things like fonts and font families. Okay. So let's head over to Schedule Home widget. Okay. So right up front, we've got our auth for our Firebase auth, and hold on a second. Yep. All right, here's our schedule home widget. Pop this open. All right. So we've got our key, our void callback, and then here's the important part, right? Our create state. And we're going to override this in a new class called schedule home widget state. There we go. All right. So here we're going to keep track of the sessions, the speaker maps. We're going to keep track of the schedules. We'll have a tab controller in case this was a multi-day event. And then we'll clear these out because we want to make sure we clear these out and load these up. Unfortunately, we're not caching any of this data. Just didn't have time because we were organizing all this. But you'd want to ideally cache this and check. And then here is this load from Firebase method. So I'm going to switch back to here in PowerPoint. So what we're doing here, ooh. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to load. We're going to have this Firebase database instance, get that reference, and then ask for the child, which is our root node. And here you could pass on what you're looking for. In our case, this would be 2017. And what we look for is every time that child is added for each one of those events, we go through. We make sure, hey, is this snapshot key for sessions? And if it is, pass that map back into this method, and we'll take care of creating those. Is it a speaker map? Handle those. Is it a schedule map? Handle those. All right. So we're not going to look at the code, but if you'd like to see the code, this is all up on GitHub under github.com Mike Traverso. So check it out. But we are going to check out the app. All right. So here's the app. If you've downloaded it before, it should look something familiar to this. And if we look at it, what I want to show you is kind of how this is broken down into widgets, okay? Because that's important. So the first thing we have here is a container. We're going to look at just one of these boxes here. So here we have a container which holds this little time slot on the left and then this little card on the right. So that container holds everything. And then next we have a row, right? Because we want to have this horizontal layout. And then within that row, we have a column, which is going to hold our time slot information. And then an expanded, which is another widget, which kind of takes up the rest of the space. And that's going to hold our card. All right. Inside our column, we're going to have a container to hold our size box. And that size box is something that we can just say, hey, we want our size box, and we want it to be this many points across. So that way we can keep this to a certain width and then have everything else flex after that. And in our expanded section, which is that card, we have this scheduled session widget. And this is going to define kind of the other layout for everything else. So again, a lot of this is abstracted away. And if we had more time, I'd jump into it. But I want to show you, like, you build your own widgets. Like, and this is an example of us building a widget. You can have widgets within widgets within widgets, and so on. You're building basically a giant widget tree that your app's going to go through. All right. So I want to point out, and I want to make sure I stress this enough, that, oh, I want to make sure I stress this enough, that Dart is very easy to learn, especially if you've done Java development before, if you've done C# development before. If you're using Android Studio 3.0, which you've already got, if you're doing Android development, you already have the ability to do this stuff. And this project is open source. I want to point out, too, this whole thing took about a week to implement. So, and I'm not talking about a week from, typical working day hours. This took a week with an hour here, 2 hours there. So one code base took care of building 2 apps for this conference, which is pretty cool, considering we didn't have to do much effort. Now, I wasn't familiar with Dart before I started using this. I wasn't familiar with Flutter before I started using this. Over time, I've kind of learned how to tweak my original code and make it more, production ready, so that it wasn't like, when you had your first access to an SDK, you're cobbling things together. So this was really cool to play with, and I encourage everybody to go get those plugins and really start playing with this, especially if you think Fuchsia is going to be the next big OS for mobile. All right. So Dart and Flutter equals love. All right. And that's it for me, folks. I'm Mike Traverso, and thank you for having me.